My talk today is called Context is Everything, and I'm going to speak about the underlying principles and ethos of my practice, and that is represented by the lecture title, Context is Everything. And by this, I mean to refer to the idea of context as being something much greater than just the physical context in which an architect works. We look at everything from the sort of wider geopolitical context, the geographical context, the economic and social milieu, and we try to sort of extract the really fundamental and meaningful histories and memories of those places and bring them into our work as a source of inspiration. And so this idea of context is really the way that we create architecture that relates to the communities that we're designing for. And it also is about being able to tell a story with our work. The title is Context is Everything. And I call it this, the expectation is normally that architects will talk about the physical context, the urban context, but we all know that the climate crisis we're facing is also a geopolitical and economic context in which we work, and our dependency on fossil fuels has led multiple issues like health crises, inequality crisis, economic migration, and now on our doorstep we have war. So I'm not going to pretend that we're just looking at buildings and looking at places. We know that there are deeper problems and issues to solve, and architecture has to be part of those solutions. And I like to show this image in contrast to that as a kind of optimism. We're asking ourselves, where did we go wrong, and how can we as architects help find solutions? How can we make architecture operate more like nature? And how can cities operate more like forests, for example, as in this image, which is a complete ecosystem of diverse interdependencies and a place of beauty. So how can we get there? And I like to show this map of Canada, where I'm from, which speaks of another kind of ecosystem, which is it's a geological map of Canada. And I love it not only for its colors, but because it's a way of understanding place as geography and geology, where the Earth's surface doesn't express boundaries, but reveals its intrinsic nature as a kind of flow. And these two images are of the kind of ecosystems that exist in the very harsh sort of rocky landscapes of Canada, of the Canadian Shield, and the sort of amazing way trees just spring out of the rocks with basically no soil. They just need water and air. So on the left is a photo of the place I spent my summers in Canada, a wilderness, and that I exchanged for London. And on the right, you can see Bedford Square, home of the AA, Georgian London at its finest, and one of the first places I came when I first came to London. And I found London a very welcoming place in terms of its culture, in terms of the contexts it provided, the layering of history, the way the evolution of communities is expressed physically, its organic qualities, and then in green are some of the places that we've worked as a practice since starting in '96. And London also has other kinds of what I call cultural infrastructure, like the London Mansion block that you can see here, which is a great form of urban housing, and it's also a kind of framework for communal garden spaces and great streets. So these kinds of places have informed and inspired me since, kept me in London in places like Somerset House, which has evolved from 1790 to 2021. We held our office 21-year anniversary party at Somerset House. That's not the party, but it will be the party we have one day. That's the festival that they hold in the summer. But it's this kind of adaptable architecture that's generous, robust, and is loved, and is a kind of sustainability that we also need to aspire to. So we published a book in 2017, Ideals Then Ideas, and this is also underpinning principles for the practice. We're aiming for authenticity, generosity, civicness, and beauty in all our work. And these are, in a way, part of this wider project to respond to context, to bring our ideals to the table, and bring together memory with the future. And I think that's, in a way, what the architect's role is, to tap into those meaningful experiences and tap into place and bring it into the future. And this is also the notion that architecture should be about storytelling. It's about making the stories and histories and collective memory of communities legible and visible. So as a practice, we really focus on 4 areas, principal areas of design: master planning, buildings for education and the arts, housing, mixed-use urban developments, and then as a counterpoint, private houses that are a way of sort of keeping our hand in on the real making of buildings. And our work has spread over the years, so you can see primarily concentrated in the UK, but also a couple of projects in Canada. And as I mentioned earlier, we're working now in Taiwan and Sweden and France, and it's really amazing to be able to sort of experience these places and respond to them. But the office is not just about work, it's also about a kind of practice culture, and we go on trips to places like the Venice Biennale or to the north of England, to Porto, Barcelona, Lille, and try to create that sort of shared experience that informs our work and inspires us. And we also exhibit, not only at the Venice Biennale, where we've exhibited 4 times, but also in other venues around the UK and Europe. And we also have a sustainability working group in the office that actually develops all of our policies, targets, tracks developing guidance in terms of sustainability policies also from our clients. And here you can see our sort of ambition to basically reduce embodied carbon and operational carbon in line with and exceeding government targets up until 2040. But of course, we need our clients and society as a whole to go along with us. But it is now our duty, as I think all architects feel very strongly about at the moment. So to go back a little bit farther in time into what the sort of origins of the work, of the practice, is really this question that I had when I first started working with very small projects at the beginning of my practice in 1996, 97, and it was this question: what can architecture be? Can architecture be just one material, like in the fold house? Can it be a single plane of metal that you cut and fold and it becomes a roof, it becomes structure, it becomes furniture, it becomes sunshades, trying to reduce it to its elements? And that language kind of evolved into a more organic, non-orthogonal language that was more about focusing, evolving the bay window as a very familiar architectural element into something more sculptural and plastic with the lens house. And then the Windward House, which was a sort of culmination of many years of working in this organic language. And the darkness of Windward House and its sort of informal geometries were inspired by the Forest of Dean and trying to bring this quality of landscape into the experience of space, but also make it a great place for the owners to cook and share the place with their friends and also share it with their collection of tribal African and Indian art. And then I sort of took those experiments in housing, in private houses, and tried to bring them into housing and even developer housing, house builder housing, and that's what New Hall B was, a kind of large-scale experiment where I was trying to make a sort of land art with housing and with those kind of organic geometries that I'd experimented with in houses. So that project, in a way, leads to a more recent project that I've described this as embracing global narratives. And this was the competition for the London School of Economics Global Hub and the Institute for Africa. And it's here. The site is here. And we were shortlisted from, I think, 160 international submissions down to the final 5. And this is a tricky problem because the existing building, there is an existing building there, and it's very complex, very badly built, very low ceilings, not a great building. You can see from this image here. And this project became the sort of crux of the debate about retention or demolition and how much of buildings like this can you and should you save. And so, but aside from that, there's also the kind of cultural project of the competition. And so I felt, as an international institute and the Global Hub for Africa, we should really team with an African practice. So we invited Studio Contra from Lagos, Nigeria, to join our team. And we worked together on the scheme. And again, it's a kind of urban design project, as most architecture is. It's about creating a new place of connection, making the LSE campus more permeable, extending nature through the site, sort of lifting the building and making its public floors accessible. And then this is just a kind of window into the process, our sort of process of modeling, very strict rights of light envelopes, many different iterations in terms of how to create a fully naturally ventilated 60,000 square meter, very hardworking, multi-departmental building. And in the bottom right, this sort of stepped massing is what we arrived at. So this, and the sustainability of this project was critical in terms of operational carbon and embodied carbon and openable windows for every office. And we also developed, one of the key things about the project was the brief element for an agora, a publicly accessible forum for debate and performance that would be visible from the street. And so our agora, which is inevitably a long-span structure for 350 people, means you have to do a lot of work to the existing building and demolish a lot and rebuild. But our language, both for the gathering spaces, was inspired by West African traditional forms of gathering, the circle, clearly. And then our proposal involved creating this large span hall, this auditorium at the ground floor, using the kind of courtyard structure to bring light and ventilation to the offices and the auditorium. And this is how our intention was to create this space that would be both inviting, it could be opened or closed, and creating a sort of expressive structure that when it's open could be used by all of the students and academics using the building, or it could be completely closed in like a UN-style auditorium, be acoustically and environmentally separated. So, and the other key, in a way, our primary intention for this project was to bring a new language, bring new voices from Africa, from the global south, to the expression of a public building in one of London's major civic spaces. And so the language we developed was really responding to the historic context of Lincoln's Inn Fields, of the Royal College of Surgeons next door, the color and texture, verticality, and even the chimneys. But we found that in our research that traditional Hausa architecture, Iranian wind catchers, Muskum, Tolaks in Cameroon, there's a kind of shared language between African or vernaculars from the global south and a kind of historic vernacular in London. And this inspired our facade proposition, and this was also intended as a way of supporting the natural ventilation of each office by making the facade operate as sort of thermal chimneys and sort of shading devices. So this project, unfortunately, we didn't win. We were saving around 40% of the existing structure, but it went to the winner preserved the existing building. But I think what's important about this is it shows what our practice does in terms of research. We treat competitions as a form of design research, sustainability research, and it's all part of the conversation. So I think in the film we mentioned the idea of housing as civic building, and this is another mission we have to really convince our clients who work in housing that housing is civic building, that it has a responsibility to the public, a condition of reciprocity. You could say civicness is where architecture not only provides for the private activities of its users, but creates a resilient framework for public life and social exchange. So we've done many projects over the years. This is estate regeneration work we did in London Borough of Brent, kind of restoring a former 1960s estate and a sort of abandoned land to a kind of contemporary mansion block typology with verandas and deep inset balconies and kind of landscape threshold space, and places, sort of sheltered outdoor rooms where to animate and create a kind of social role for the facades. And you can see how it sort of responds to the existing context and creates sort of generous places in contrast to the sort of bison block that you can see in the distance there that were really sort of faulty buildings, oppressive, and sort of symbols of the dysfunctional urban principles and architectural principles of the 1960s. But we stitched our scheme into the existing estate, and on the right you can see some of the buildings are being retained that are still performing well, and creating this integration and mix of times and periods to create also shared public spaces. And we exhibited this project in 2016 at the Venice Biennale. We're also doing, we've just finished a project in Tottenham Hale, and this is One Ashley Road, it's called, and it's on the site of the former barrel pencil factory. So although most of the factory is gone, there's still some of it remaining. We've thought it would be really interesting to kind of draw on the iconography of the barrel pencil, the kind of hexagonal plan form, the orange skin, the lead, the gray interior, and that would inspire the language for this building. And it's also another project where we treat it as a kind of carving process where the sort of maximum developable mass is sort of our starting point, and then we sort of carve away where we need to for spanning the Victoria line or bringing in light, and then manipulating the volumes that emerge from, this is another kind of courtyard tower, to create an urban tableau that creates foreground and background and roof terraces. and kind of humanizes what could be a very dense cluster. And so this is the way it addresses and creates and frames a new public space, and there are residence roof terraces on the interstitial garden levels. And here you can see the kind of inner skin, which is faceted and gray, with the outer skin brick, red brick, and patterned balconies that again are sort of building on or drawing on the geometry, the sort of hexagonal geometries of the site. And these patterned balconies create shadows, a kind of patterned shadow, so a sort of automatic ornamentation through light and shadow. And we've also created a colonnade to sort of filter the noise from the street and create, again, a kind of generous threshold space, a civic space that kind of mediates the environment. And here's the foyer, sort of triple height foyer. And another project that we're doing in East London is IQL, International Quarter in Stratford. And this is a project that is also about transforming the identity of a place. At the moment, IQL is office-led, and Lend-Lease, our client, wanted to turn it into a mixed-use neighborhood and sort of introduce a residential element at the prow where it meets the Queen Elizabeth Park. So our idea was to, again, we were working with a kind of hexagonal plan form to use the sort of rotations and stepping of the massing to bring nature up onto the higher levels of the building and create this kind of generous colonnaded base, so it acts as a kind of threshold from the park into IQL. And this is the quality of landscape and the idea of immersing this new residential community in the park, bringing the park into closer into the way people will be living day to day. And at the other end of the map, I showed you a project we're doing in Surrey, BC, which is near Vancouver. You can see Vancouver in the distance in this view. And in a way, this project of urbanizing the suburbs, which is a huge, huge challenge and which is going to be happening for the next couple of hundred years, I'm sure. Our project in the center of this slide is really one of the many projects that the City of Surrey is implementing to kind of create a new urban center. And our proposal sort of broke all the rules intentionally of development in Vancouver, which is generally the tower and townhouse model on the left that creates a sort of fortress of private space and kind of exclusion in a way. And we replaced it with a much more dispersed and permeable urban plan with 6 buildings that bring public space to the center of the site. And it's called The Passages, and you can see here the kind of language we're working with to bring a sort of organic and meandering relationship between the buildings and to invite the neighborhood into the center of the plan. The towers are very big in terms of their footprint, and they're working very hard, and we use this efficiency to kind of pay for the generous public realm and public amenities that are all distributed around all the ground and first floors. This project was also inspired in a way by the forests, the pine forests of and fir cedar trees of BC, trying to work with a language of shingles and bark and a kind of textured, shaded facade that is really the opposite of the glassy towers of Vancouver. And then here you can see the public space at the center, which again is about creating a sort of particular identity of landscape that you could really only find in BC. And all of these projects in housing we brought together at the 2021 Venice Biennale as this project called Home Ground, where we sort of gathered all of our housing projects and created a Campo Marzio, or a sort of shared space, and exposed the ground floors of all of our projects as part of the public realm, as contributing to the public realm and creating a forum for public life. And then the last big residential project I'm going to show you is in Toronto, and this is Keysight, and this is a master plan that we won in a competition, international competition, with 2 other practices. And the idea here was to bring, because the master plan is on the waterfront. This is Lake Ontario, and this is Toronto's waterfront. And there's this huge barrier of the Gardiner Expressway, Lakeshore Boulevard, and the CN, the Trans-Canada Railway, creates this massive barrier at the north end of the site. So our idea was to enable nature to sort of leapfrog these barriers and use the buildings as a kind of staging post to reconnect to the lakefront, to the waterfront, and sort of kickstart a new waterfront ecology. And these diagrams show, so our building is this one. So we're at phase 1, and this is phase 2 and phase 3. And the subsequent phases are probably quite far into the future. And our sort of idea for phase 1 was, to sort of rethink the tower podium model, which is also typical in North America, and to integrate them into a single form with the curved plan to sort of pull the tower from a curved base that forms a sheltering courtyard, public space, and then to sort of envelop the tower with balconies, trellises, and a kind of living, not exactly a living facade, a facade where residents would have the opportunity to grow significant numbers of plants, because the balconies are generally 2 stories high, so you can have small trees and shrubs and climbers. And so the whole facade becomes a sort of host for insects, birds, and plants, and creates the opportunity for residents to be serious about creating a sort of a facade or a building, a super tall building. It's 69 stories. That's a host for nature. It's also clad in ceramic, green ceramic tile. I think also the building in IQL is blue ceramic tile, drawing on the history of porcelain works in Stratford. And these green ceramic tiles are bringing solidity and sort of amplifying, drawing into the sort of historic tradition of beautiful terracotta facades in Toronto of the 19th century. And the building obviously has to work in winter, and we acknowledge that plants don't grow in winter unless they're evergreen, and so it's about creating shade and privacy and shelter, as well as places for growth. So reinventing archetypes, I think you saw in the film that the Cohen Quad, there's a relatively extensive piece on that building, but I thought it was worth reiterating a few key principles of the project that sort of speak to this idea of sustainability and longevity. As we all know, Oxford is a city made of university buildings that are quads, and each quad is a college, and each college is a community. And so the architecture really of these quadrangles is representing a community. It's a sort of direct translation of community into built form. And this, of course, springs from the monastic tradition of a monastic community living, working, studying, and worshiping together in a very multi-purpose, self-sustaining compound, which was the abbey, or the monastery. And of course, this tradition evolved and became the basis of all of the ancient universities, and this is Exeter College's first kind of iteration as a as a kind of compilation or a composite framework for communal study and living. And some of our research into the typologies when we were doing the competition, and then the wonderful chapel, neo-Gothic chapel by George Gilbert Scott that inspired the diagonal patterning of the roof, the diagonal lattice of the tower. But of course, we had to sort of translate this ancient kind of model, and the brief was to bring a contemporary language to and identity to the quad and to the collegiate tradition. And this section just shows how, in a way, we disguised a 6-story building within a 3-story envelope using the mansard roof as a way of getting extra volume and extra space, and how the curved roof language steps down to create a kind of friend for the neighboring 2-story houses. And in a way, the density of the plan is what I sort of wanted to speak about, that the density of uses in this building is so intense to a certain extent. Not only is it this S-shaped quad that weaves around 2 courtyards and with teaching spaces and performance and auditoria, amphitheater, learning commons at the center, but it also has 90 student rooms. And so it's about a community living and studying together, and it's also open to the public with this sort of crossroads, this sort of 3-dimensional crossroads, which is the learning commons at the center. And this is Oxford's first social learning, dedicated social learning space. And so this little sequence of axonometrics show the density of the uses. So this is we excavated a full basement where the lower levels of the learning commons, all the service spaces, a library, a BS 4545 archive, and then on the ground floor, the teaching spaces and auditoria and cafe and more learning commons, and then student rooms in turquoise, family kitchens at the center, more student rooms, and fellows rooms, and teaching studies at the research offices and teaching spaces under the roof. So this kind of packing of really dense programs into a single building was a way, first of all, of optimizing the site, but sort of, in a way, ensured that it would be generous, it ensured it would be a piece of the sort of academic fabric, not just student halls, and also bring a new identity to this community that was inspired by that monastic tradition. And this sort of journey through the learning commons, you can see the kind of open, informal study spaces that the building offers, the thermal mass of the concrete that keeps it cool, naturally ventilated, and just the adaptability of these spaces that have multiple uses, and every time we go there, they change them. The college changes how they're set up in terms of furniture. This is the archive reading room. And then these devices like double transparency and forced perspective that allow you to see from one place to another and create this idea of a journey or a story that the building tells as you move through it. And so this sort of maybe completes the picture from what the film showed, and here you can also see how in the evening, at night, the theater or the auditorium space is this kind of glowing, transparent beacon. We also thought of it as like a big house, that it's like a big, generous house where students could go up to the roof and study in common rooms, out on the roof terrace where you have this view across Oxford, and a kind of new language, a sort of softened language that becomes a kind of new landscape as well as a roofscape in Oxford. So this was the kind of paradigm shift that we were trying to achieve from the kind of ecclesiastical model to a more open and inclusive and welcoming home for a community, and that also contributes to this sort of urban context of Oxford in a positive way, sort of as a building on the edge of the academic centre. So in conclusion, I just wanted to end with some points about sustainability, because we all are so embedded in the sort of technicalities and the kind of science of producing sustainable architecture. But we know we must reduce energy consumption, we must reduce carbon emissions, but we also must enable emotions with our architecture, such as attachment, such as belonging to place, and connecting to nature. So let's make better contexts for humans and nature. Thank you.